Hey everyone, welcome back to class. So, taking a look at chapters 6 and 7 this week. And first off, really kind of interesting in this article I had you check out the birth month affects lifetime disease risk. And really kind of a weird thing because is this really true? And this is one of those interesting areas when it comes to epidemiology where epidemiology can potentially show associations, but is it the actual cause? For example, and some of you may be aware of this, there has been some epidemiologic reports that suggest eating red meat increases the risk of diabetes. And that really kind of blows your mind because when you think about diabetes, you think about insulin insensitivity caused by too much glucose. But there's apparently a potential biologic mechanism that's associated. I don't have the articles pulled up, but there's a potential biological mechanism. One of the byproducts from the metabolism has some role in that. Now, what is the risk difference? Well, the risk difference is very small. It's like one study I recall is like 1.2 times greater risk of developing diabetes if you're eating excessive amounts of red meat. But then again, there's a big challenge when it comes to diet types of studies, because if you look at some of the latest keto and carnivore diet types of studies, individuals are improving their A1C levels. And so this kind of ties into what we're talking about here. Does your birth month increase particular disease risk? This is a retrospective study. They state the monthly birth rate compared between the case and control populations for each condition, adjusting for the monthly birth month variation effects, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, it can be confusing. Is this a case control? Is this a retrospective? It's really just kind of a fascinating article regardless. And if we take a look at things here, they found these different time periods where people were at greater risk of developing things like atrial fibrillation. So why would that be? Atrial fibrillation, I mean, that can be caused by all types of damage to the heart, coronary artery disease, leading to changes in the electrical conduction. Like, it doesn't make sense. Hypertension. Why more in January? Doesn't have more to do with diet and stress and lack of exercise? So, a study like this, I don't know that people find it interesting, but I don't know that they will be able to go on and do any future work in this area. All right, chapter 6, here are the key messages. I'm not going to read through these here, but we're talking about chronic non-communicable diseases. And the decline in death rates that occurred during the 19th century in high-income countries was principally due to a decrease in deaths from infectious diseases. So that makes sense. As we got better with knowing the science behind things, we could identify those particular pathogens, how they might affect the body, where they might come from, and then ultimately figure out treatments. Fast forward to 2020, 2021, 2022, identify COVID-19, identify how it's transmitted, come up with therapeutics like Paxlovid, and then potentially with vaccines similar in nature to the yearly flu vaccine, where it could potentially reduce the chance of catching it that season or reduce the symptoms that one might experience. So again, on this figure here, it shows key points related to the identification of the TB bacteria, and then the different therapeutic measures and preventative measures. Now notice that most of the decline in mortality took place before those advances, before the advances in the therapeutic and preventative measures. So, what helped? Changes in nutrition, changes in housing density, sanitation, and other environmental health measures. Looking at Brazil here, infectious diseases accounted for 45% of all deaths in 1930, only 5% in 2003. So kind of showing a similar thing as the prior slide there. So a decrease over time. But what happens sometimes is we get improvements in one area, but other areas, something's got to get you, right? So there's an increase in cardiovascular disease from 12% in 1930 to 31% in 2003. Why might that be? Well, maybe due to having more income and then resultant food choices that people make. Or maybe people are living longer to the point where they could actually succumb to heart disease versus an infectious disease or some other disease. So changing patterns of mortality and morbidity indicate that major causes of disease are preventable. Now, your textbook highlights or points out that the lifetime mortality risk for any population is 100%. Kind of a no-does statement there. Most populations are affected by specific diseases which can be prevented. So, the goal being to identify things that cause disease, to try to reduce the risk of developing that disease, and to hopefully have as healthy of a life as possible. Most populations are affected by specific diseases, again, which can be prevented. Migrant populations, for example, develop patterns of disease of their host population. Here's an example. The rates of gastric cancer in people born in Hawaii to Japanese parents are lower than those of people born in Japan. However, after 2 generations in the United States, the people of Japanese heritage have the same gastric cancer rate as the US population. So as people get used to, as generations adopt the culture of that country, you see that then pattern develop. The fact that it takes a generation or more for the rates to fall suggests the importance of an exposure such as diet early in life. So here we're looking at geographical variation in disease occurrence within and between countries. This can provide some clues as to preventative potential. So changes in lung cancer mortality in the United Kingdom and France. We see that males decreased in the United Kingdom, whereas males increased in France. And so what is potentially the cause of that or the result of that? Well, in France, there was an increase in tobacco use at the same time that there was a decrease occurring in males in the United Kingdom. So epidemiology helps to identify modifiable causes of disease. For example, coronary heart disease, and then the identified risk factors. So 50 years of epidemiologic studies of coronary heart disease have identified much about the causes from individual risk factors to cellular mechanisms in the arterial wall. And I think what's fascinating is that it's continually evolving or improving. There's some debate nowadays about LDL cholesterol. Is LDL as bad as excessive sugars at causing that endothelial damage of the arterial wall? I don't know. This is just something I've been kind of paying attention to. It's really kind of fascinating. And again, it gets into diets and what is the best dietary strategy or not. Large differences between populations and risk factor levels are still not well understood. Causal inference needs to account for both disease causation in the individual and for the social, economic, environment, and political contributions, these upstream determinants that are beyond the control of individuals. So these upstream determinants of health, you see these below, they're beyond the control of individuals. Things like globalization, urbanization, population aging. But there are things that are under people's control. And we see these on the list: tobacco use, alcohol abuse, unhealthy diet, physical inactivity, etc., etc. Social determinants of health are the conditions in which people live and work. Addressing social determinants of health is the fairest way to improve health for all. Good health care is always important, but health can be improved by improving housing conditions, social position, and decreasing occupational risks. That brings us to the levels of prevention. 4 levels of prevention: primordial, primary, secondary, and tertiary. Each level targets factors or conditions which have an established role in causing disease. Precautionary prevention. This is the prevention term where actions are taken because risk is deemed too high, even though evidence is incomplete. So like a 5th level of prevention. Primordial prevention. This level of prevention created in response to increasing knowledge about epi related to cardiovascular diseases. It is known that coronary heart disease occurs on a large scale only if the basic underlying cause is present, a diet high in saturated fat. Again, this is really fascinating because just last week I was talking to my cardiopulmonary physical therapy class, and we found articles, epidemiologic articles, suggesting saturated fat doesn't increase risk. Again, it's a fascinating area. I just kind of bring it up here because it's just a fascinating topic, and I'm not saying one way or the other. It just seems like the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet are the ones that are the best for us, the most well-researched. Don't know that the carnivore diet is the best at this time, but it's just really kind of a fascinating hot topic. Now, as socioeconomic development occurs, risk factors that were not present, for example, in China and Japan, they had lower rates of coronary heart disease at one time. They become present as higher incomes come about, and as they start to maybe eat or consume more saturated fat. Coronary heart disease was rare in these countries, even though there was cigarette smoking and hypertension. As socioeconomic development occurs, such risk factors can be expected to become more widespread. The aim on primordial prevention is to avoid the emergence and establishment of the social, economic, and cultural patterns of living that are known to contribute to an elevated risk of disease. So here is a primordial example by taxing tobacco to try to decrease overall tobacco consumption. And so we see the consumption of cigarettes start to decline in the 1990s as the real retail price, so the price and the inclusion of tax, increased. Primary prevention. The purpose of primary prevention is to limit the incidence of disease by controlling specific causes and risk factors. 2 approaches: primary prevention directed to the whole population with the aim of reducing average risk. This is the population or mass strategy. Number 2, people at high risk as a result of a particular exposures. This is the high risk individual strategy. The population strategy is to reduce the risk in the entire population. The advantage is it does not have to identify the high-risk group, but simply aim to reduce by a small amount the level of a given risk factor in the entire population. The disadvantage is that it offers little benefit to many individuals because their absolute risks of disease are quite low. An example here is a seatbelt requirement. Each day, millions and millions of people drive without getting into wrecks. But those who do get in wrecks, wearing a seatbelt reduces the risk of death or significant injury. So, again, I don't know that you could call a seatbelt requirement a disadvantage, but you get the idea what they're talking about here. It's applying it to everybody, even though only a few may be at a risk or at a given have a level of risk. High risk individual strategy. So the approach here focuses on individuals above an arbitrary cutoff point in the attempt to reduce disease in those individuals. The disadvantage is that it requires a screening program to identify the high-risk group. This is difficult and costly. An example of a high-risk strategy is smoking cessation. And what I'll have you do here is I'll let you read through this, so pause the recording now. Okay, I've assumed that you paused the recording and read through this. This is an example, again, of a high-risk strategy. Table 6.2 breaks down the advantages and disadvantages of the primary prevention strategies. If you want to read through these, please welcome to pause the recording and do so. Table 6.3 approaches to the prevention of diabetes and obesity by looking at things between a population approach and a high-risk approach. High-risk approach, you'd be looking at individuals that maybe came to their primary care providers for their follow-up, and they were identified as having high A1C and or BMI. That'd be an approach that could target those individuals, whereas a population approach, applying something to everybody, may or may not be that effective. For example, social marketing, public policy, pricing. We've got examples like that where there are locales that put taxes on sugary beverages or taxes on alcohol, yet people continue to drink those beverages, many of them high in calories. And if you look at our overall population, we have not had a decrease in our overweight and obesity statistics. So the population approach may not work as well in those cases. Now let's talk about secondary prevention to detect the disease early through screening and early diagnosis. Secondary prevention applied only to diseases in which the natural history includes an early period when it is easily identified and treated, so that it does not progress to the more serious stage. Examples of secondary prevention include testing the eyesight and hearing of all school-age children. Remember when they used to have us do scoliosis tests? Screening for high blood pressure in middle-aged adults, testing for hearing loss in factory workers, and skin testing and chest radiographs for the diagnosis of TB. Tertiary prevention is aimed at reducing the progress or complications of established disease and is an important aspect of therapeutic and rehab medicine. It consists of the measures intended to reduce impairments and disabilities, minimize suffering caused by poor health, and promote patients' adjustments to incurable conditions. All right, table 6.1 illustrates the different levels of prevention. Just included this in here. It's not something I think you're going to be questioned upon, but it's also in your textbook. Let's pause here now and we'll pick up in part 2.